So as you may have noticed, no two ENTPs are identical. And there's a good reason for this. First and foremost, personality is comprised of more than just cognitive functions, and we all live our own individual lives, accruing our own unique experiences, and these experiences go on to shape our identity, inform our behavior. However, the cognitive functions can go some of the way to explaining such individual variation, and in this video we're going to be exploring these variations and presenting the cognitive subtypes that can manifest as a result. But before we go any further, I just want to recommend to anybody who has not already done so to subscribe to the channel, and in advance it would be absolutely amazing if you can share this video with anyone who you think might benefit from it. First up we have the divergent ENTP, named thusly owing to their relationship with their divergent auxiliary function, their introverted thinking authority. Here, introverted thinking very much reigns supreme, with extroverted feeling, the natural opposite of this function, being somewhat neglected as a result. Now, extroverted feeling within this type is the convergent auxiliary, being after all of the same orientation of the dominant function. With this function being effectively bypassed, there is little convergent activity within this type, and therefore comparatively less responsibility being taken for the external world around the type. With the majority of this type's energies directed towards introverted thinking and thus rendered divergent in the process, the divergent ENTP is much more of a natural observer. Why is this? Well, convergence is the realm of action, whereas divergence is the realm of observation. Since extroverted feeling is being bypassed, extroverted intuition, the dominant function, instead has to effectively outsource to extroverted thinking instead. But extroverted thinking here is sitting underneath the divergent auxiliary, and thus is itself divergent by nature. In order to employ this function, in order to perceive the objective world around them, the ENTP has to render their dominant function more divergent in the process. As such, there is a mildly convergent use of extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking in order to perceive the world around them, and a divergent employment of introverted sensing and introverted thinking in order to effectively observe and collate the data being gathered. And as you might imagine, this is a pretty introverted subtype, with the primary area of convergent activity being effectively bypassed within the type. The extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking dip that is usually entered through a extroverted feeling, extroverted intuitive gateway tends to be far less accessible for this particular subtype. Rather, there tends to be a sense of disconnect from external concrete reality and a general pull towards a much more introverted, reflective and observant logical state. But with introverted thinking being so strongly favoured here, the divergent ENTP does tend to benefit from a much more fluid dominant axis. That is to say, the type can more easily rotate into an introverted sensing dominant position in order to innovate upon perspective and discover new introverted thinking connections in the process. As such, the divergent ENTP tends to be intellectually inclined, and owing to the lack of convergent activity within this type, tends to be of a much more humble and altogether less egoistically charged disposition. The convergent ENTP, however, is the exact inverse of this. There is far more egoistic activity here, and generally a much stronger desire to control the outcome of one's life. And this convergent energy here essentially activates the extroverted feeling convergent auxiliary, allowing the ENTP to control and affect the social world around them. But it also allows the ENTP to dip down into extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking in order to maximize their impact upon external reality and precisely execute trained skill sets. As so much energy is now directed towards convergent activity, there tends to ensue a certain power struggle between the possessive function of extroverted feeling and the authority function of introverted thinking. That is to say, the need to affect one's external world can pull one's attention away from the intricacies of one's internal frameworks. Of course, the authority function within any type is seldom suppressed, but while the logical frameworks driving one's external behavior in this instance can be very reliable, they tend to suffer from a lack of nuance as a result. Furthermore, the dominant axis here will tend to be employed only to enhance one's social utility. There will ensue a kind of lack of natural curiosity and convergent employment of introverted sensing and introverted thinking only to the areas that directly affect this type's locus of control. For example, this type will often master skill sets, develop intricate social frameworks, but pay comparatively less attention to philosophy and existential concepts. And indeed, whereas the aforementioned divergent ENTP would enjoy an extensive introverted thinking, introverted feeling dip, the convergent ENTP by comparison tends not to spend enough time in a truly introverted state in order to fully access this introverted feeling function. And as such, this convergent ENTP tends to be more prone to a true introverted feeling blind spot, oftentimes outsourcing to what they can do, or even relying upon the extroverted feeling feedback of other people in order to conceive self-concept and identity. However, owing to this heavy extroverted feeling employment, the convergent ENTP will often take pride in their ability to take responsibility for and indeed positively influence the emotional states of other people. Extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling has a emotionally predictive nature, and this particularly extroverted feeling sensitive subtype can enjoy a certain level of social mastery as a result. Owing in part to an introverted feeling blind spot and a general desire to control one's world, this subtype tends to be a little bit more egoistically oriented than the others. Indeed, this can on occasion manifest as a sensitivity to criticism and a deep feeling of general vulnerability. And indeed, this very vulnerability can lead to a deceptively private personality, an individual who appears very open and sociable on the surface, all the while using masks to conceal their true vulnerability from others. While within convergent ENTPs, there tends to be sufficient employment of introspection so as to facilitate efficacy of external interaction, there are some ENTPs who tend to avoid introversion altogether. Known as the glider subtype, this is an individual who essentially glides right over the top of their introverted functions, taking full possession in this case of both extroverted intuition, extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing, and extroverted thinking. And while this subtype can be mistaken for an ESFP, as a result, the introverted thinking authority still exerts considerable influence over the dominant functions. So here, the agenda is less a realization of authenticity in concrete reality, and more a desire to maximize external experience and collate these experiences so as to ensure a continued sense of internal competence. And therefore, the more experiences that this individual can acquire, the more the subtype will feel A, able to engage with stimuli in a competent manner, and B, integrated with reality as a whole. And since introverted feeling is likely hyper-unconscious within this individual, such maximal connection with reality is almost necessary in order to make up for feelings of disconnect and even personal loss. But in many ways, although certainly not always, this individual will be an amplified version of the convergent ENTP, able to take new experiences, new challenges in their stride, and oftentimes giving the appearance of full integration with reality. And in some senses, this maximal engagement with external reality can in some ways make up for a lack of introspection. After all, this type is engaging in novel conversation, assimilating myriad different experiences. In many ways, this will be a learned individual. However, out of all the subtypes, the glider is the most likely to have a suppressed oppositional function, manifesting in the fullest extent the inferior function of MBTI. Here, reflection upon the past, a sense of legacy, a concrete sense of internal reality. These things tend to be disregarded or even actively evaded in pursuit of new and engaging novelty. However, so far I've only painted extremes of both introversion and extroversion, but there are some variants who are much more ambiverted, that is to say, a mixture of extroversion and introversion. And there are two ways to be ambiverted essentially, one of which is to stay purely within the cognitive stack, a mix of NEFE and SITI, or the other way is to essentially dip down into the opposing orientation of all of your functions. And this is where the ambivert subtype comes in. The ambiverted ENTP is essentially bang in the middle between INTJ and ENTP. However, unlike other subtypes, this is much less volitional and more innate. That is to say, for the subtype to take hold, the ENTP must already be residing somewhere within the ENTP-INTJ interstice. So the dominant functions here are taking a portion of responsibility for extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling, and a portion of responsibility for introverted intuition and introverted feeling. And similarly, the opposing functions here tend to observe a portion of extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking, and a portion of introverted sensing and introverted thinking. And this tends to, in comparison to a standard ENTP, result in a bit more pragmatism and instantaneous frameworking, and in comparison to a standard INTJ paradigm, a little bit more internal clarity. And while this may sound like the best of both worlds, there is a catch. Full immersion within either external or internal world takes extensive volitional dipping from this particular type, and as such, extensive cognitive development is necessary for this type to realize the potential of either of the types it sits within. And if this development does not occur, the type may find themselves trapped within a stasis of cognitive neutrality, never ever accessing a function to its full potential. However, it is perfectly possible for an ENTP to be ambiverted within their own default cognition, with dominant and opposing functions in a state of equilibrium. Here, extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling, this plethoric external social landscape, can be effectively used divergently, that is, to be observed, just as introverted sensing and introverted thinking can be used convergently, to be acted upon, for the ENTP to come up with original frameworks and perspectives. However, this default ENTP can lack a degree of fluidity as a result, with the primary functions being used to essentially make up for those functions outside of the default state. As such, extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking can seldom be employed. So, a lack of ability to directly affect one's objective world, a limit of one's locus of control to the external social landscape, and the type may even lack a degree of introverted intuitive, introverted feeling, self-transformative capacity. And this can manifest as an individual very secure within their natural predisposition, but also limiting the scope of influence in order to stay within the safety of natural parameters. As a result, this individual can be somewhat more stable in cognition than the aforementioned subtypes, but also lack a degree of fluidity and self-realization as a result. However, what if I told you the ENTP can have the best of both worlds, acquiring balance within the psyche while obtaining all of those positive characteristics of all of the aforementioned subtypes combined? This is where individuation comes in. You see, all of these molds explored in the video so far are predicated upon a kind of lock, whereby we perpetually inhabit one pathway at the expense of all others. You see, we are likely born with a predisposition towards one function over another one, but it is when we habituate this predisposition that we become locked in this spiral of using one function over another. However, it is possible to open all of the doorways to these modalities, for as long as functions are reconciled within the psyche and one has overcome any phobia of a function's employment, oftentimes incurred through the over-reliance upon that function's opposite, TAP can become entirely fluid. We can gain access to all of these modalities and more. An individuated ENTP can maximally affect one's social world one minute and philosophize the next. They can experience life to the fullest and then relate upon that experience, effectively transforming the self in the process. Furthermore, convergent employment of introverted sensing and introverted thinking not only allow this type to master skill sets, but extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking, accessed from the dominant position, allow this type to enter a kind of flow state, allowing for precise execution of the skill sets in question. A subtype can of course have its own respective advantages, and much success can be achieved in life through, staying within its parameters. But individuation allows us to use all of these subtypes to adapt our cognition to changing context, one subtype 1 minute and one subtype another, as the situation necessitates. And such an individual can use all areas of their cognition to overcome any challenge and ultimately experience all corners of reality. Staying within set cognitive parameters can of course give us a feeling of safety and allow us to find a niche within an increasingly competitive world. But individuation allows us to shape our own meaning and ultimately carve our own niche within society. Now, of course, individuation does not occur overnight. It after all entails a gradual breakdown of habits we've accrued over the course of our lifetime. However, just like any other habit, we can effectively unlearn our subtype and in the process access all doorways of our psyche. And how is this achieved? Well, first and foremost, it's very helpful to see your current cognitive manifestation as a system of reflexes. Much of it is entirely automated. So you'll see one thing, you'll be given X stimuli, and then you'll automatically lean towards processing it in a certain way. Just being aware of that automation is a very important first step. And from that point, just begin to question for every different situation you find yourself in, whether or not your preferred mode of cognition is optimal for the context. Does the situation call for refined frameworks, polished execution, or does it call for certain embracing of chaos, to embrace what is not known and form conjecture and original perspective? Does this social situation call for my input and effect, or would it be better to observe it for a prolonged amount of time before I begin taking responsibility for it? This beautiful new experience, would my life be enriched by interacting with it? Or in this case, would it be better to just observe it, reflect upon it, and allow it to integrate more thoroughly with my own identity and self-concept? In this current stage of my life, should I rely upon the feedback of others to shape a portion of my identity? Or should I take time out from socializing altogether to more limbically reflect upon my own self-concept, forge my own unique and independent identity? Is assuredness of competence and freedom of agency everything to me? Or are there other pathways towards finding meaning in life? Don't get me wrong, individuation isn't going to turn you into some kind of superhuman, but it will allow for cognition that is no longer acting against your own best interest. This is the true reward of individuation, a psyche in harmony, no longer warring against itself. So that concludes the video. I hope it was useful, I hope it was maybe even inspiring on some level, and I will be making more individuation-specific content in the future. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the contents of this video, be sure to share it with them as well. If you haven't already done so, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel, and be sure to hit that all-important bell icon next to the subscribe button as well to stay notified of future content. And just a few more call to actions before I go. If you're interested in exploring more of the very fundamentals behind CPT, I do recommend checking out the CPT ebook. And if you are curious about what your type might be, or just like to know about how your own type applies more specifically to you as an individual, I do offer consultations and type services. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you are interested in supporting the channel and the theory on that additional level, that would be massively appreciated. But of course, it already goes without saying, I appreciate your support over here on YouTube as well. We actually had our first Patreon-only live stream over there just the other day. It went really well, the interaction was absolutely fantastic, and I'll be doing that once a month over there on Patreon henceforth. So that is it for me, and I'll be back in a week's time. For now, take care.